Hi students, so let's go to the task 2 of the mock number 1. Now, as I always instructed students, whenever you go to the examination, the first thing that you have to be concerned with is the format, which is the briefing note, and it is addressed to whom? The board of directors. So please keep that in mind, students, which is practically important. Assess the governance changes that is needed for Nctech in case if an external investment is needed in the future. So it's very much confusing now in case an external investment is needed in the future and the governance changes. Now, if you observe one thing, a student who has already gone through the pre-seen material will be able to understand that the governance factors, for instance, like the founders own 30% of the organization's investment funds. Correct, no students, if I'm not mistaken. That is one thing the students needs to keep in mind. And we have to understand what is this external investment. And I can effectively say that may have some connection with the exhibits, if I'm not mistaken, because in the examination, students, these verbs like assess, all these high level verbs needs an evidence from the exhibit, and you have to be very much focused with the information given in the exhibit in order to score well in the examination. And the second requirement is discuss the cultural changes that needs in Nctech, and with regards to overall leadership in case if there is a step down from the founding director. Now students, again, if you see cultural changes, as per the websites of ACCA, they're saying better to modify your answer with cultural web. That doesn't mean you have to write down the cultural web again, but if you can structure the answer in case with this cultural web, it will be very easier for the exam paper marker to understand. Or else, if you can write down points which are more specific to the situation with some futuristic points, that too will be more than sufficient enough to score well. So the professional marks in this case is for evaluation skills, which is 4 marks, and the analysis skill also, which is 4 marks in total. So I believe this is very practical and very clear for you all. So initial stages, students, you have to plan properly in order to get this understanding. So my point of view here is, students, I will effectively do my answer plan, because students, planning your answer is very critical, because you read 2-3 times and you don't make the mistake. So the verb I am very much concerned is assess, and the format, if I'm not mistaken, in this case is the briefing note, so that it will be clear. So the verb in this case is assess. Okay. So I'll write down here governance changes. Governance changes. That is how there is a governance change. And students, the verb assess come means generally, if you observe the answers, they are not going in so specific, but there was a video with regards to the verbs. But the point of view with assessment, risk assessment means we do a time-based analysis, or we effectively identify the factors based on the impact. That means low, medium, and high. That is the assessment. Low, medium, and high, the ranking based or the timing or the urgency based point of view. But even if your answers are not having that, that is also fine, students. So just make sure you have the understanding of the governance changes what is needed. And the part B of the question effectively focuses on what, students? Discuss. And the verb what they are using is cultural changes. Look at the term, students, cultural changes in Nctech. So students, as I told you, better to structure the answer using the web of cultural web. So I'll write down here, students, cultural web can be one point of view at the moment. I believe that is very clear and fundamentally right as well. Now students, what we have to do now is we can effectively go to the exhibit number 3. So founders concern, okay, the funders concern, the people who are effectively giving money to the organization. The management is currently planning to invest more on research and development, as you are aware, and also there is a willing to partner with any tech firm in order to make sure there is some sustainability in the business process, considering the changes taking place in the external environment. So this is one strategy they are effectively following because there is a flux situation. So we have to make sure how are we going to overcome this flux situation, and effectively the overcoming can be using investment in R&D or partnership as per this exhibit. So don't memorize this. This is just only for the exhibit. Therefore, the current institutional investors have clearly mentioned they are not willing to provide any additional finance since they are not willing to take any risk. Okay. So that is something that we have anticipated because they have effectively told they are not willing to provide any additional finance because of the risk involved. And if I'm not mistaken, these investors effectively focuses on fixed income. That is the dividend what they get, they are highly dependent on that. The management has approached the bank. The bank has strictly mentioned that they are not happy with the current governance structure of Nctech. So bank is one of the funder, if I'm not mistaken. And therefore, they need to have a change in the board of directors and also more transparency with regards to remunerations, nominations of the board of directors. So one point of view is remuneration factors is not clear because who designs the salary of the board of directors, and nomination, how are they appointed is also not much clear. And also students, as I told you, 30% stake the directors have in total, and the balance 70%, as you know, are very much clustered. They don't have any direct relationship. So the decision makers are this 30%. But considering factors like bank, I don't think they will be concerned of giving money here. Further, the management has also considered some large global tech firms for partnering. And the global tech firm has also insisted they are not happy with the current governance structure of the entity. So again, students, the tech firms are also not interested in the structurization of our business process. Further, one more factor they have strictly reported is that the culture of Nctech is more like entrepreneurial culture. That is true as well because the founders are only managing the organization. They have insisted this is too needs to be updated. Therefore, some considerations can be provided with regards to business investment decision making as well. Therefore, the management is insisting on you to provide sufficient information on the governance and also cultural changes with regards to the leadership factor. So, students, now as per our initial understanding, we have to come to a conclusion. What is the conclusion? Funders. Who are the funders? External funders. That is bank. Now, bank and, if I'm not mistaken, a tech firm. The biggest concern they have is how the remuneration is provided and how there is a nomination. And in simple language, whether there is a transparency as well, because 30% shareholders. So students, now I have summarized this entire paragraphs into my understanding. So this is what is needed. Now students, if I observe the governance changes, what is required as per the factors given. Now it's an assessment. So students, in real life, you can't immediately say the directors to go. The rationale behind that is they are the founders, so they have very much understanding of how the business operates. So in that case, students, the first thing that we have to be very much clear is, I just write down here, reduce the power of the directors, That means students, in the non-executive board, their powers can be minimized if I'm not mistaken. And then students, another factors, if I'm not mistaken, is I'll just write down here, reduce the power of executive directors. That is one more factor. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, the next thing is make the NED more independent, because currently students, the NEDs are not having independence. The rationale behind that is these founders are having the investor stake as well. So NEDs are under their control indirectly. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, is slowly you can go for a succession plan, if I'm not mistaken, because we don't have a succession plan at the moment, succession plan for the founders transition, And students, if I'm not mistaken, I can just make sure this is having the idea of talent management. What is that, students? Talent management. Because currently one thing, our employees are leaving the organization. The rationale behind why they are leaving the organization is they are not having much recognition because the owners are the management at the moment. And then students, the next one, make the remuneration and nomination transparent. Remuneration and the nomination decisions transparent. Transparent. We have to know how these things are affected. That is one more factor, if I'm not mistaken. And then students, just to make your understanding very clear, provide some assistance to institutional investors to nominate proxies, because students at the moment they don't have any proxies also nominating their business. So nominate the proxies. So I'll write down here, nominate proxies. And then students, the next thing is make external auditor independent, because that is also very, very important, no, students, if I'm not mistaken. Independent, and also have assurance for the audit work, because you need to have a second opinion for their audit work. So I believe this is one factor that the students needs to consider. Now, the next thing, students, if I'm not mistaken, is the cultural changes we have to make when case if we are changing. So the first thing, students, if I'm not mistaken, I can just say the power structure. That is who makes the decision. That needs to be changed. Correct? Now the power structure is the founders. So it should become management rather than founders directly involving. Management should come into the picture. So I'll write down here founders to management, because management means independent board of directors who are appointed as employees by the organization and the nomination committee. So they should have the power structure in day-to-day operations. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, this organizational structure in simple language, students, it should end up as more towards a hierarchical structure, or I can effectively say a professional structure of business development rather than an entrepreneurial structure, because here if you see the decisions are directly made by the directors. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, the control systems within the organization. At the moment we don't have any control system, but a risk committee can come into the picture and make sure they implement some control systems where there is a proper understanding of how things work, what are the consequences in case if they are not working, all those functions. And then students, the rituals and if I'm not mistaken, routines. Now example, students, there is no proper induction sessions, right? No inductions or training. So we can make sure there is proper rituals and routines also for the people. And then students, if I'm not mistaken, the symbols. Now, if you see students, we are a very old organization, but do we have any symbols like logos, anything that is coming to the picture of our mind? So we have to create our symbols, our uniforms, all those things. In that case, it will give some understanding and idea. And finally, students, the stories, because these are inimitable factors. So stories needs to be well documented with emotions, because you have to say emotions as well. Then only the quality of the structural change will be fine. So students, I believe that everyone is very much clear with how these answers needs to be structured. So the first thing, since the answer plan is done, I'm going to write down here answer. And firstly, I'm going to write down a heading as briefing note. Look at the verb I'm using, students, briefing note. So students, in the briefing note, firstly, I have to say for the attention of, that means FAO, for the attention of, I'll write down here board of directors, if I'm not mistaken, students, board of directors. And then students, I'm going to write down a basic introduction. So it will be very easy. This briefing note assesses assesses the governance changes, that is needed, the governance changes that is needed when there is a change in the business ownership. That is one factor to be considered. Also discussion of cultural changes in leadership, in case if the founders are stepping down. Students, now if you understand this very clearly, the verbs have been used in the introduction, because students, that is very important. And technically speaking, as per the mind, the read the mind of the marker, in that it is clearly mentioned you will not be getting marks for the introduction point, so keep that in mind. Now students, reduce the power of executive directors. So what I can do, I can just make sure I copy paste the students and then I develop the answers. That is a good way of doing, or I can say that's a good practice if I'm not mistaken. I just copy this and then students, I just paste this, and what happens is my structurization becomes very practical and very clear. So reduce the power of the executive directors. 30% investment stake 30% investment stake and executive directorship executive directorship in Nctech by the founders will have extreme decision making power decision making power extreme decision making power, where there can be self review threat and self interest threat. Understand it very practical point of view. Therefore the business decisions will not take the factors of other investors and providers of financial funds like bank. So this is one point. So I am going to write down. Therefore, the power of certain elements like participation on the non-executive committees needs to be reduced, since it may affect the independence, and also the executive power needs to be reduced, since they have the voting power as investors as well. They have the voting power as investors as well. So I believe, students, this is one assessment that we have to keep in mind. And then students, make the NED more independent. So I just write down here, the chairman needs to be independent to ensure the executive board the executive board have a better business point of view on decision making. In the case, since the 30% investors, who are the executive directors, appoint the chairman The chairman is not independent. The chairman is not independent. The chairman is not independent. So, students, I believe it is very practical at the moment because the chairman is not independent mainly because of the ownership of 30% and the decision-making power that has been possessed by these people. Further, there needs to be a step down. There needs to be a step down in the long run because I told you assessment. Okay, in the long run by the founders in case if they need more fund, if they need more funds for research and development or business growth, research and development, or business growth. Understand that very practically, students, because it is very much important that you have to make them independent because currently the independence for the chairman is not there. The rationale behind that is the chairman is more powerful, generally considering, but in this case, the executive directors are more powerful. So, succession plan for the founders transition, the founders needs to make sure that they need to build up new talents for their roles when they are stepping down. In the current perspective, there is no such plans, resulting in high level of labor turnover and loss of key staff. Therefore, a transition plan is essential. A transition plan is essential because students, this is very important because at the moment, students, only they are making rules, they are the decision makers. So that is one more thing as well. This will enhance the developments and also finance requirement as well. Because students, when things are better, it will increase these things as well. And the next one, students, make remuneration and nomination committee transparent. The current system does not explicitly reveal or explicitly disclose how the remunerations and nominations are made. How the remunerations and nominations are what students made. Therefore, in that case, the company needs to make sure that they are able to have a better understanding on how the remunerations are paid, and also the nomination factors needs to be disclosed. Nomination factors needs to be disclosed. So the founders needs to step down. The founders needs to gradually step down. Founders needs to gradually step down. So students, that is one factor that you have to keep in mind. Now, students, moving to the next one, provide some assistance to the institutional investors to nominate proxies. That is a very important point. One more factor to be considered is the institutional investors don't participate in decision making since they don't have a common proxy. Therefore, to enhance the governance A common proxy can be nominated. In that case, the company will be able to have a better understanding as well. So students, that is one factor to be considered. So this is important thing. And the final one, students, just to give you the point of view, I'll just write it down. Make external auditors independent, have assurance for audit work. The auditors, the external auditors needs to be appointed, needs to be appointed, needs to be appointed, needs to be appointed based on the voting power, based on the voting power. That is one factor. In that case, the company needs to make sure that they are able to have a better systems in place where the investors and directors don't influence their decisions. That is one factor. And also there needs to be assurance for their activities. So students, in that case, please try to make sure this is properly constructed. And finally, students, if I'm not mistaken, this is done. And the next one is the cultural changes that is needed. So again, students, I will copy these points. And what I will do is I'll just write down the next one, cultural changes in case if the founding directors are, if the founding directors are stepping down stepping down stepping down. So students, we have to be very much practical in that. So what I have to initially do is, it's not so complicated, students. What I have to initially do is a basic assessment of these points. Now you see here the previous one, I did the answer planning first, and then what I'm doing is I'm defining the points based on the answer planning structure. So students, the power structure, so I'll write down here, the power structure needs to be more management oriented in the future. Since the decision making of any projects needs to be in the interest of Nctech and the shareholders. And other stakeholders. So students, this should be how it should be made, rather than the founders making decisions. This may enhance the accountability, and also this may ensure there is a better understanding on financial funding utilization. Because students, if you see bank, everything, when they give money, they are concerned about how you are spending that money. Now the next one, students, if I'm not mistaken, organizational structure. The organizational structure needs to be more professional. Professional. Does it make sense? Of course, right? Needs to be more professional, where the directors and employees, managers, and the employees, are aware of their roles, and how they need to ensure there is a proper decision making process, decision making process, proper decision making process. So keep that in mind, students, because it is very important and essential as well for your thinking aspect, rather than entrepreneurial decision making, rather than entrepreneurship decision making, which is having self interest, which may have self interest, that is the control systems. Now, students, I have to make it very clear. Currently, or I can say, the decisions on resource utilizations needs to have a control mechanism on how things work. Example, the time for the employees, the policies on HR, all these are control systems. And risk management process, all these needs to be more transparent and enhance the value for the investors with regards to transparency policy. Keep that in mind. And then, students, rituals and routines. Now, the next thing is very important. Due to the current changes, the talent management will be essential. The talent management will become essential in the case where there needs to be proper induction. And training for the staffs as well. This may ensure there is a proper systems where the employees will be encouraged to stay long rather than resigning. So this is also one more factor. And then, students, symbols that Nctech they want, that is the logo information. Now, one thing I can say, the logos and the brand needs to be well connected, rather than founders only. In that case, the communication of the business needs to be practical. And also there are chances that the business needs to make sure that they update their business mission, visions, and value. They update their business mission and value, mission and values as well. And the last one, students, if I'm not mistaken, that is the stories. I'll just end it up so that it will be clear. Fallen countries, one of the first cloud computing business is a great story which needs to be preserved so that the future governance will be based on a value-based governance as well. Therefore, these are the cultural changes that can be expected. Full stop. And students, finally, I'll just write down conclusion. Therefore, in order to attract more investors and funds, there needs to be an update in the governance structure. Stop. And also, a cultural change is needed. Correct, no students, I believe it is clear for you all. So this is how you have to make sure you connect your answers to the situation using the exhibit. Thank you, students.